I'd now like to introduce Barbara Shaw, who not only has been waging a very courageous battle, swimming against the tide of public opinion, because so many people, especially down in Melbourne here, in the most well, you know, the best place in Australia for an Aboriginal person to live, even in enlightened Melbourne, the majority of Aboriginal people, or the majority of the people out there among you, believe that Noel Pearson is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and one of the great heroes of all of you lot, the people who regard themselves as progressives in Melbourne, is the likes of Professor Langton, my associate up at Melbourne University. Well, I offer you tonight, folks, an antidote to the lunatic views of Pearson and Langton and Mundine. My cousin Mundine, he's good brothers here tonight, so don't pick on him. He's one of the good part of the family. Warren is the white sheep of the family, folks. But I offer you an antidote to begin with in the form of Barbara Shaw, whose father, I might say, is a man who I worked with extensively in the 80s in the old National Aboriginal Islander Health Organisation and other organisations, who's one of the great associates and, you know, battlers along with me in the old days. But ladies and gentlemen, please give Barbara Shaw a warm welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I wish it rained like this in Alice. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the country on which we meet tonight. It's good to see some old friends and maybe some new friends. For those that don't know me, my name is Barbara Shaw. I'm a descendant of the Kaytetye, Arrernte, Warlpiri and Warumungu people in the Northern Territory. I have many family ties with communities right through the Territory because of my kinship relationship, as well as immediate and extended families that live in the areas in which myself and Auntie Rosie comes from, which is the prescribed areas under the Northern Territory Emergency Response. I'd like to say that this is my second time meeting with Gary. And I have a lot of respect for Les, who actually opened the gateway to take me overseas and voice my concerns in the international arena. And also acknowledge Jon Altman, who makes me salad every time I go to Canberra. So yeah, before the intervention came into the Northern Territory, Alice Springs was known as the murder capital of Australia because of alcohol-related deaths. A lawyer by the name of Nanette Rogers put a spotlight on child sexual abuse, although some of the cases she highlighted were old ones of the past. An inquiry was led in 2006 on the behalf of the Northern Territory Government, which is called a Little Children of Safety Report. Now, how many people know of that report in this room? Okay. Now, the Northern Territory Government sat on it for about 6 weeks, which then led John Howard, our former Prime Minister, and Mal Brough, the former Indigenous Affairs Minister, to their announcement on this evening in 2007. Prior to that, Gary has mentioned old uncle from the north, Queensland, Noel Pearson, came on television Tuesday on a 7:30 report. That following Thursday, John Howard and Mal Brough actually announced their intervention into saving Aboriginal women and children. So therefore, an election was also happening later on that year. So the media centralised the issues in their reports, and especially the ones where Nanette Rogers was releasing in the papers. The Aboriginal situation was the result of nearly 30 years of the CLP, or the Country Liberals, and plus 11 years of the Howard government. So they say we neglect our children, our families. Look what the government in the Northern Territory has done to us. Even though Labor has been in power in the Northern Territory for 7 years, it was overruled by the federal government for many years. So because we are a territory, federal government can override territory law at any time and their governments. So there was a black backflip on many Aboriginal programs. During 2007, the Northern Territory also carried out consultations and reforming local government. So now we have, I guess, the abolishment of the Indigenous community councils, now amalgamated into the 9 super shires in the Northern Territory. In 2008, the super shires were formed. So local governments are now been abolished. There were job losses, assets withheld, and people were unable to take over, they were enabled takeover of community assets, so no longer Aboriginal people, I guess, as Les was stating, self-determination in their own communities. People were removed from CDEP. Now, you couldn't income manage a wage, so what they did was scrap, the federal government under the intervention scrapped CDEP, made everybody work for the dollars, so now in the Northern Territory we have a high rate of unemployment. So the measures under the Northern Territory emergency response, there is no more an emergency in the Territory. Through our eyes anyway, and there never was. So there's more policing in the Territory. Alcohol and carver bans, pornography bans, compulsory acquisition of Aboriginal land, banned on customary law and cultural practices in the courts, and Auntie Rosie will talk a lot more about that. Scrapping of the permit system, welfare quarantining, scrapping CDP and statutory powers. So therefore, before the intervention, I thought I had rights. But Les stated there are basic rights, but there are also human rights breaches in this country, especially when the government has signed on to seven United Nations conventions or treaties. I thought my rights were protected, but under the Northern Territory Emergency Response, set aside the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. So I was born into this country. I was actually 1 year old when I got my rights. And then I found out I no longer had rights, myself and my children, because I was racially vilified, racially stereotyped, demonised. I led a court challenge against the takeover of our town camps, but the intervention laws were too strong for us to win. So when John Howard and Mel Brough put these laws into place, we couldn't go through the court systems here through domestic law. So then I started going out to communities and talking to people, talking to human rights lawyers. After meeting Les, I began to more or less open my eyes and my ears on what rights we had in this country and what channels we can use to actually challenge the government. So throughout 2008, I travelled to many communities, collecting information for human rights lawyers, and we led a delegation to Canberra twice. In 2009, we actually put the report into the CERB, Les mentioned it, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, as an early warning, urgent action. So then that way the Australian government can realise that people weren't happy. And basically we then started using these channels. I've held meetings in Canberra, rallies in Canberra, meetings here in Melbourne, Darwin, travelled across Australia as well as overseas 4 times, and supporting people and advising them of their rights, and also sharing our stories from the Territory. The intervention, when it came out, made me feel sick as a mother, as a carer, auntie and grandmother who previously had rights protected, that I had nowhere to go. The intervention has told the rest of the country that Aboriginal people are useless and can't manage their own affairs, don't look after their children, and the men are child abusers. Racism in the territory has increased, especially in the urban centres, Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Katherine, Darwin. The intervention has given mainstream media, or mainstream Australia, the licence to treat Aboriginal people badly and in a racist way. If you watched the 7:30 report on Monday, Tuesday, it clearly shows how the way we get treated. When we go shopping, it's like, how much you got on your basic card? Check your balance today? It's just institutionalised racism, so anyone can treat us the way that they want to, and very differently. The intervention has, where is it? Yeah. As time went by, more and more people lost their jobs, and with the scrapping of CDP, jobs were promised when Shire Council came in and did not happen. Much work was done by outsiders and contractors. I had my house newly renovated under the Sahib. The people has spent over $600 million on renovating our homes in prescribed areas. You got homes there that don't even have shelves. You got kitchens and pantries that don't even have shelves to store their foods. You've got programs that have been slowly financially starved out of existence, and one of them is my service provider, Anmatyerr Council, which my father was a founding member along with his grandfathers and, for 21 years. And now my brother is the CEO. And we've been having a lot of difficulties talking with both tiers of government about the social services to deal and tackle with the issues that face our people on a daily basis. Jobs were promised, by the Shire councils. So you've got more people that are more disadvantaged because they're not out there on their communities, looking after their communities and delivering the service by themselves and for themselves. So now you've got a lot of people on the unemployment line that have come into our major town centres, and all they do is just get on the grog, get on the ganja, and then the crime rate in Alice Springs in the major town centres has risen because there is a failure of governments and social services to deliver these services out in the communities. So long-standing local government organisations were undermined and overtaken. Now, when the intervention came out, we were actually going through negotiation processes with Mel Bruff. He wanted our town camp leases, which we have in special purpose, leases in perpetuity. So he actually wanted our town camps for 99 years for $60 million. We said no 3 times over. Then you've got Noel Pearson coming out with mixing welfare reform with land tenure, and then you got your John Howard and the Mel Bruffs bringing out the intervention. Now, stronger futures. I don't know what to say about stronger futures. There are 3 bills under stronger futures. One is the enabling change to the Social Securities Act. So, with Les was talking about the areas around the country, there's actually 5 areas. 2 areas where Les comes from, that's Logan City and Rockhampton Downs in Queensland. You got Bankstown in New South Wales, Shepparton in this state, Playford in South Australia. Now what we've done is looked at the population of those areas. The majority of people living in those areas are in fact Aboriginal people. So you can't tell me that this is a racist policy. And the other 2 acts entrenches provisions of the Northern Territory intervention. So now you've got Social Securities Act amendment again. The first one was for the intervention, now the second one is for, the stronger futures. Now, the two acts that entrench provisions from the minister, she's actually given herself, or the next minister that comes along, powers to supervise us. That means us. And then maybe some of you who may be on Centrelink or, but yeah, these bills give the minister even more powers to control over Aboriginal people's lives and land. Anyone got time? No, I'm talking about me. This was not what people asked for in the so-called consultations that were held last year. Not enough time was allowed or notice given to proper consultations to be held. Some communities missed out altogether. Feedback was cherry-picked and suited the government's agenda. People were tired of talking because they were never listened to. A good example of not consulting with people is my 75-year-old grandfather. He lives on his community. One day they said and put up posters around the community that government officials is going to come and talk to you about the bills. I rang up and I said, "You must wait, I'm coming." And then what happened was the meeting was cancelled and they were never consulted at all. 100 k's away there was another community. Posters were put up around, there's going to be consultation. I said, "Don't." I said, "Wait till I come out." And then it was cancelled. And then they said that there was going to be a bus to come and pick everyone up from the community. 200 k's in the next community. So you can see where there was no proper consultation done in communities. These are only two communities that I know because I have immediate family living there. Another place, another time, Alice Springs. 2 consultations I went to. 7 camps were represented the first time. It was held on a night like this, cold, wet. There was a funeral on that day, so nobody was really consulted. The second consultation in Alice Springs, I went, just to add colour. Only because there was service providers and people living in Alice Springs there. Guess what it was? The main saying that was happening that day. It's good for those people. It's good for them. Oh, we don't want it, but it's good for them. You know, those people are the ones that are drinkers, child rapists and everything like that, but you can see how people talk about us. You know? So yeah, the situation now, more and more Aboriginal people are going to jail in the Northern Territory. Not because they are criminals, but because they are poor. They don't have the money to fix up their cars that are damaged on bad roads. We have corrugated roads, dusty roads. You know, the corrugation in our roads like is about that high from the next hollow. So you got all these unroadworthy vehicles driving around the Northern Territory because of the conditions of the roads. They don't have the money to pay for their fines that the police are slapping on them for minor offences. There is an increase of young people going to jail. I just recently sat in the juvenile justice courts in Alice Springs for my nephew. He's been caught up in all this crime because of peer pressure from the kids that live in the suburbs. One of my big cousins that live on the homelands outside of Alice Springs had told me, and she doesn't know what to do, that her 11-year-old grandson was in the lockup, got locked up, was put into the cells with adults, and then in jail for 4 weeks while waiting for court. This is an 11-year-old boy. This boy I would call grandson. The youth suicide rate has increased and making life harder for people and continuing to treat them as second-class citizens isn't going to help address this. So while we have a high rate of incarceration, I've actually given statistics to Gary, he might want to read out later. We've got a high rate of unemployment, so therefore a lot of people are drinking, getting caught up in crime and landing in jail. You heard about the 2 tourists last month that got raped by 3 young young fellas? These boys were trying to get home. What happened was that they stumbled across a vehicle, but they weren't aware that someone was inside. Apparently they had a gun, a toy gun. So you understand why these kids are doing these stuff. But I feel sorry for the tourists, you know. Nothing more I can say about that. The unemployment rate for Aboriginal people is appalling, with many people losing what pride they had in working for their communities under CDEP. CDEP is Community Development Employment Program. It was the main source of employment for people, and it was the main source of income. Now we're all working for the dole. The dole doesn't pay compensation if we get hurt. The government might say more jobs have been created, but what can we see? You got the fly-in, fly-out builders, contractors from other states and territories. You had your extra police call in from other states and territories. And you've also got extra people coming in from the state and territories to work in Centrelink because of the hard work that it takes. So you can have all these general business, government business managers living in the communities as advisors for the government. I think they're there as spies, you know, you can say. So the future may be stronger, I don't know. The future will not be better with these new bills. I don't want my children or my grandchildren to grow up being treated this way. We want to be treated equally, free, with the same rights, but we want to be able to be ourselves, to stand up proud as Aboriginal people. I would like to see an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person as an Aboriginal Affairs Minister in the federal government. One day I hope it may be less, you know. The government needs to be transparent and accountable to the people who elect them. We need a Bill of Rights, and we need the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples enshrined in our law. Les sort of talked about the Constitution. It's used people that live in the big cities and people in this room that will make a change for people like us. If they can do it in 1967, you can do it today. Yeah. To continue and lobby, what do we want? It's because of our rights are being violated. Every day an Indigenous rights is violated. And it's because of the policies that this first world country has. And yet people like us, like these two of the past, that's why Gary Foley sat at the Tent Embassy for a very long time. That's why Les does what he does. And hopefully my friend does the same. Australia needs to be educated on the true situations for many Aboriginal people living in third world conditions in a first world country. There should be no blanket approach for dealing with us. We are many and we are varied. Like Vincent Lingiari said to Golf Whitlam, let's be friends, when he poured the dirt into his hand. The way forward, last year a proposal was put together based on feedback over the intervention of the last 4 years, meeting with many and visiting 2 communities and gathering around the Northern Territory, so everyone here should have a copy. I've actually handed that to the Prime Minister herself when she paid a visit to Alice Springs. It's called Rebuilding from the Ground Up. An alternative to the Northern Territory intervention was presented to the Prime Minister, and also to Marion Scrimgeour, Deputy of the Chief Minister at the time. It is a positive document that proposes giving responsibilities and control back to the Aboriginal communities. The only way forward is true partnership, not government control. We want to walk together but we want to have true respect and recognition that we are the ones with the solutions to the issues facing us today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Barbara.